Alrighty folks, so today I'm going to show you how to take the fluff from your crate and turn it into a cool little wool felted ball. So the first thing you need to know is that you should watch this entire video the whole way through before you even think about starting to get started. Just like when you're baking something, you should read the recipe all the way through before you do the first step. So I have a bowl, some very hot water, some cold water, some soap, and my fluff. And I definitely have a towel down underneath me because this is going to get a little bit soggy. Now, my first bit of fluff that I'm going to use, my wool, I have already started going like this. This is something you're going to want to do. We're going to carefully pull the little bits apart and kind of just stick them back together so they all get fluffed together. I sent you with 2 or 3 different colors of wool, so you have the choice of mixing some or deciding on one color that you want to start with. Our goal here is going to be to turn this into felt. So we're going to get started, and then while I'm doing some of the work, I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about felt. The important thing for us to know before we start is that these little bits of hair all have teeny tiny scales on them. If we zoomed in on a piece of any mammal's hair, but especially the hair of a sheep, we would see that there are little bumpy scaly bits on it. Now, those little bumpy scaly bits kind of pry themselves open a bit if the wool gets hot or wet or experiences a lot of friction. That's that rubbing sort of a thing. When that happens, those little open bits can grab onto each other, and the wool can slowly condense itself into one solid object. Instead of being lots of little hairs, it's going to form one solid thing. So, we're going to get a little bit of dish soap, about that much, and water that is as hot as your hands feel comfortable with. The hotter it is, the faster this will work, but obviously you're not going to want to do a project that's burning you. That would be silly. In general, if you just turn your kitchen faucet on to as warm as it goes and let it go for a minute, stick your finger under it, that's probably a good temperature. Mine's still a teeny bit hot for me, so I'm stirring it up with a spoon to get it all bubbly. This would work without the soap, but the soap kind of speeds it along. Now, before I get this hand wet, this is my leftover wool. I'm going to set it off to the side, and I am not going to touch it again. I need to have an assistant for this work, because if any water, especially hot soapy water, gets on this wool, it could start felting when I don't want it to. It probably wouldn't felt much, but no matter what, it would give you an icky mess. So this is going off to the side, and I'm going to make sure not to touch it. Now, what we're going to do with this wool is start winding it into a teeny ball. We're going to pinch one place and kind of fold it under, and pinch and fold it under, and then slowly just start wrapping it around. We're trying to make a ball, kind of like when you roll a ball of yarn, except that instead of having that strand, we're just kind of sloppily trying to curve all the wool around. It's not going to want to stay. If I release this, it's going to pop itself back open. So don't let go. When we've got it like this, we're going to carefully squish it under the water while still holding it in our hands. And hold it there for a minute. Once you feel like it's soaked up a good amount of water, assistant, can you remove that pile of, there we go, thank you. You're going to set it in your hand, and using the tiniest amount of pressure you possibly can, you're going to push down between the palms of your hand and start slowly rotating. Now, really seriously, as little pressure as you can possibly do. We're going to do that a little bit, and as you start to feel it condense, as you start to feel it squish down under your hand, you can exert a tiny bit more pressure and a tiny bit more pressure. We're going to do this for probably about 5 minutes. If it starts to get cold, dunk it back in. If it feels really soggy, you can carefully squeeze out some of your water. And just keep on rolling and keep on rolling. If it starts to feel nice and hard, you're doing the right thing. Watch mine. If I squish it, you can see it still gives a ton. This is starting to get felted. The little hairs are starting to grab onto each other, but they definitely aren't solid yet, so we need to keep going. If you notice at any point that your water feels like it's only warm, you're gonna wanna refresh it, which means dump it out, put in more soap, put in more hot water, and get it all stirred up. Because this process without the hot water would take a lot longer. Now, while I'm working on getting this ball started felting, I would like to tell you what I think about when I think about felt. Now, you may have used felt in big, colorful sheets that you get at the craft store. And sometimes that felt is made of wool from sheep. But sometimes it's a type of synthetic wool, which means it's made out of stuff other than the normal version. And in this case, that means it's made out of basically fluffy plastic. That's the stuff that we use in the classroom sometimes when we're making little tiny stuffed animals. Let's check on this. Still way too squishy. Gotta keep going. Now, that type of felt is all well and good, but there is another type of felt, and that's the kind that we're making right now. Now, we know that for a very long time, way back to our second timeline of humans that we've looked at, that our ancestors were keeping animals. They were keeping them and raising them for food, and they were keeping them and raising them to do work for them, and they were keeping them and raising them for their fur or for their wool. When sheep first started, they would shed their wool all throughout the year in little fluffy bits, like a dog or a cat does. But when those early humans started keeping the sheep and keeping them for their wool, they slowly selected for sheep who shed less often, until eventually they had created the kind of sheep we have now. Sheep that don't shed their wool without the help of humans with scissors or a razor. Remember that story of Shrek the sheep? How he ran away for years and years, and when he came back, he was so covered in wool he almost couldn't see? Because sheep need humans to take their wool off of them. Now, those early humans, squish check, still really squishy. Keep on going. At this point, I'm going to start pressing a little harder and spinning a little bit faster. And if I notice that in my hand it's going squish while I'm trying to rotate it, then that means I'm going a little too hard. All right. So I like to think about those early humans and when they first discovered the idea of felting wool. Now, we know that for a very long time, humans have been taking the skins of animals that they've hunted and taking the skin with the fur still on and using it as clothes or blankets and things to stay warm. And I imagine that when humans were first beginning to keep sheep for food, they probably kept their skins with the wool on them as well. Maybe some of those skins, after a long time, the hair started to get all matted together just from being used, maybe from rubbing between two other layers of clothing. Or if it was on something that people sat on a lot, maybe from their bottoms rubbing back and forth. Maybe that was the first way that someone discovered felt. Maybe someone was out walking, maybe with a herd of sheep, and their shoes were starting to rub on their heels. And so they took a little bit of wool and shoved it down in their shoe. And then they kept walking. Maybe by the end of their walk, it had felted itself into a little ball. Maybe something completely different happened. Those people didn't leave records, so we don't know what they did. But I like to imagine that it could have been one of those. Now, let's check this out. This is starting to look pretty good. When I squish it in, you can see that it still squishes, but it kind of stops. This is as far as I can squish it without pushing really hard. You're going to have to do some experimenting to get this to work right, and don't expect your first ball to come out perfect. It might have a weird little crack in it where it started to split. That'll happen sometimes. If that happens, can you hand me a little piece of fluff, Austin? Like about this much. Thank you. If you get a little crack in the ball while you're working on it, you can just take some extra fluff, a little bit of extra wool, and wrap an extra layer around, and then carefully keep felting. You can also do this if you want your ball to be larger. At this point, when mine is most of the way hard, I could carefully add some more to keep expanding it out and out and out. Whenever you add more wool on, it's important to go back to rolling really, really delicately until that stuff has hardened on a little bit. When you feel like yours is as hard as you want it to be, and there is some choice in that, once it squishes but not too much and isn't falling apart, you can stop. But if you want to keep rolling and keep pressing harder and harder, you can get a really hard little ball of wool. Whenever you feel like you're done, you're going to switch to some non-soapy water. I'm not quite done, so I'm just going to tell you about that while I'm still working. You're going to switch to some non-soapy water. It can be warm or cold, doesn't matter. And you're going to rinse out your little wool ball. You're going to do that by setting it in the water and squishing it and setting it in the water and squishing it until no more bubbles come out. If you look right now, you can see that I started rolling too hard. My outside layer is trying to pry itself off of the inside layer. So that means I need to back it off a little bit, roll not quite as hard, and keep going. I think I'm going to take a second and change out my water as well. So we're going to do a little bit of soap, some of my warm water, and that's not too hot anymore, so I'll just use that. Oh, yes, it is. Put a little cold water in there. Okay. Swirl my soap around, and we'll keep going. Now, we don't know who discovered the idea of felting wool, but we do know that once people started felting, the idea spread, and the idea spread all over the world, to anywhere where people could find an animal with the right kind of hair. It could be a sheep, or a goat, or a muskox, or a llama, or an alpaca. All sorts of different animals' fur could be used for this process. Technically, you could felt the fur of a dog or a cat, but it wouldn't be nearly as nice. And so early humans didn't do that very often. The very often is a story for another day. Now, we know when we look back that some people used their early felting experiments as clothing, and some people used them for hats, and some people used them to make shoes, and some people even used them to make houses. There were some kinds of houses that groups of people who traveled around used that had wool as the outside covering. These were nomadic people, which means people who travel around and don't have a house that stays in one spot. Often they have, wow, I'm very soapy. Often they have some sort of a house that can be broken down into bits and moved. And there are some groups of people in Asia and some groups of people in North America, very, very far away from each other. Some groups of people that way a long time ago used to build their houses that same way, using big sheets of felt that had been made huge enough to make like a giant tent. Some people probably still do that today as well. I know I have a hat that is made out of felt. The top of a pool table is made out of felt. A top hat is made out of a very special, different kind of felt. The outside of a tennis ball, if it's a nice one, is made of felt. felt is all over the place, and it is something that can be used to do all sorts of fun things. Things that are practical and help you to live and feed yourself and meet your basic needs. But also things that are just fun, like what we're doing today. All right, my ball is on the squishy side of finished, but I declare it to be finished. So I'm going to dump out my soapy water, and we're going to work on cleaning this out. I'm not going to be super particular about getting mine clean, but I want you to make sure that when you do this step, you keep dumping out the water and getting fresh water, and dumping out the water and getting fresh water until there are no more bubbles, because you want your wool to be all nice and clean. During this process, if you notice that it's a little squishier than you think it should be, mine's a bit on the squishy side, you can go back to the hot water with the soap and try again. When you feel like it's good, squish it until no more water comes out. Then you can kind of roll it around in a towel a bit and let it sit out in a warm place until it is totally dry. This means like maybe in your kitchen somewhere away from the sink, something like that. And I urge you, which means I hope a lot, that you will let it sit for at least 2 days before you do anything else with it. Because if you were to take this and go put it in a little drawer somewhere with special things, and it wasn't dry on the inside, it could mold, and that would be disgusting. So make sure it's all the way dry. When it's all the way dry, you have a choice. You have, at the end of all of this work, the beginning of a lot of other choices. If you have a cat, I can tell you that cats often love to play with little wool balls. You might give it to them. Maybe you want to get a needle and some string and thread through it and make it a necklace. Maybe you want to make a collection and make a cool chunky wool necklace. Or something where you hang it with some beads as an ornament to hang up for the holidays if you like. If you want, I sent you some acorn tops. Those acorn tops look really cute if you stick them on top of the wool. You get a cute little wool acorn. You can do that with any kind of glue you want. Just make sure that you squish it pretty well while it starts drying to make sure it sticks on. And if you ever choose to gather extra acorn cups, make sure you read about how to dry them out properly. Otherwise, those will get moldy or you'll end up with weird little bugs in them. Don't worry, the ones I sent you are dried properly. So now that you have watched this entire video, you are ready to find your supplies. I want you to make sure you check with an adult. Make sure it is okay that you take over the kitchen or whatever space you're using. And make sure you have an assistant who can hand you extra bits of fluff. If your first one doesn't work, it doesn't matter. Keep going. It's fun. You can make a bunch of them. Give the ones you don't like to your cat. Do anything you like with them. Throw them in the air and shout hooray. But whatever you do, have fun, because that's the point of exploring. And have a good day, my friends. Bye.